The corridor smelled of damp stone and the faint sweetness of dying flowers. Ara's footsteps barely whispered against the flagstones as she carried her basket of linens toward the western wing. The housekeeper had sent her there with little more than a pointed finger and a tight-lipped warning to keep her head down. This was her third day in the Alpha King's house. 3 days of silence and sidelong glances from servants who wouldn't meet her eyes. She paused at the heavy oak door, balanced the basket against her hip, and pushed it open. The room beyond was dim. Curtains blocked most of the afternoon light. The air hung thick and stale, as though no one had opened a window in weeks. And then she heard it. A small, broken sound from the far corner. Ara set down the basket and stepped deeper into the room. Her eyes adjusted slowly. A low bed sat against the wall. Blankets pooled on the floor, and there, curled beneath the stone sill, was a wolf pup. He was tiny. Too small for his age, if she had to guess. His ribs showed beneath a coat that should have been glossy, but instead lay matted and dull. His breathing came shallow and quick. She knelt slowly, keeping her movements soft. The pup's amber eyes cracked open. He didn't lift his head. "Hey there," she whispered. "I won't hurt you." He whimpered again, and the sound cracked something open in her chest. Ara had grown up in a house full of healing. Her mother had been a midwife, her grandmother a woman who knew every herb that grew in the forest. She'd learned to read pain in the set of a shoulder, the curl of a hand, and this pup was drowning in it. She reached out carefully, her fingers barely brushing the fur along his shoulder. He flinched. She froze, her breath caught and waited. Slowly, his eyes opened again. This time he held her gaze. There was something ancient in that look, something that didn't belong in a child. Exhaustion. Resignation. A kind of suffering that had learned to stay quiet. Ara's throat tightened. She let her hand rest gently against his side, just enough to offer warmth. "I'm Ara," she said softly. "I'm new here. I didn't know anyone was in this room." The pup's ear twitched. His breathing evened just a fraction. She stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, her hand a steady presence. Minutes passed. Outside, she heard footsteps in the hall, the distant clang of pots from the kitchen below. But here, in this forgotten room, the world narrowed to just the two of them. When she finally moved her hand to stroke along his back, she felt it. Her fingers caught on something rough beneath the fur. She leaned closer, gently parting the matted strands near his shoulder blade. Her stomach dropped. Burns. Small, circular marks, silver white against the skin. Some had scabbed over, others still wept. Ara's pulse hammered in her ears. She'd seen burns like this before. Her grandmother had treated a wolf once, years ago, after a trap laced with silver had nearly killed him. Silver poisoning. She sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Someone had done this. Someone had put silver on this pup over and over, disguised in something he couldn't escape. Her gaze swept the room and landed on a small table near the door. Bottles and jars sat in a neat row, grooming oils, brushes, a comb with teeth too fine for a wolf's coat. She crossed to the table and picked up the largest bottle. Lavender oil, the label read, in careful script. She uncorked it and held it to the light. The oil shimmered faintly, a metallic sheen that didn't belong. Ara's hands shook as she set it down. She turned back to the pup, who watched her with those two old eyes. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't, not in this form. But his gaze didn't waver. She returned to his side and knelt again. This time, she let her hand rest on the floor beside him, palm up, an invitation instead of an intrusion. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly, "but I know you're suffering, and I know how to help." The pup stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stretched his muzzle forward and rested it against her palm. The touch was feather-light, tentative, but it was trust, fragile and new, and Ara felt the weight of it settle into her bones. She stayed with him until the light through the curtains turned gold. She didn't try to move him or clean his wounds, not yet. She simply sat, her presence a quiet promise that he wasn't alone anymore. When she finally rose to leave, she took the bottle of lavender oil with her. Evidence. Proof. She didn't know yet who she would show it to, but she knew she couldn't let it disappear. At the door, she glanced back. The pup had closed his eyes, but his breathing was steadier now, less labored. "I'll come back," she said. "I promise." Before we begin the next chapter, if stories like this draw you in, if you believe in second chances and the quiet strength it takes to heal, please subscribe. You'll never miss another tale like this one. Ara slipped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her. Her heart still raced, her mind a tangle of questions and anger and something fiercer she couldn't quite name. She didn't know who the pup was. She didn't know why someone would poison a child. But she knew, with a certainty that burned in her chest, that she wouldn't let it continue. She tucked the bottle into the deep pocket of her apron and made her way back down the corridor. The housekeeper would be waiting, sharp-eyed and impatient. The other servants would whisper behind her back, the way they always did with newcomers. But none of that mattered now. Ara had found something horrifying in that little pup's fur, and she had made a promise she intended to keep. Ara returned to the dim room an hour before dawn, when the house still slept and the corridors lay empty. She carried a canvas satchel over one shoulder, the weight of it familiar and grounding. Inside were jars of salve her grandmother had taught her to make, clean linen strips, a bottle of spring water, and a small vial of honey. The door opened without a sound. She slipped inside and closed it behind her, her eyes adjusting to the deeper darkness. The pup lay in the same spot beneath the window, his small form barely moving. She set the satchel down and lit a single candle on the table. The flame caught and swelled, casting soft gold across the stone walls. "It's me," she said quietly. "Ara, I told you I'd come back." The pup's ear flicked. He didn't lift his head, but his eyes opened, tracking her as she crossed the room. She knelt beside him and let him see her hands, open and empty. "I brought things to help," she said. "I need to touch the burns. It might hurt at first, but I'll be gentle." He watched her, that ancient weariness still heavy in his gaze. But he didn't pull away. Ara reached into the satchel and drew out a small jar of comfrey salve. She unscrewed the lid, the faint green scent rising between them. Then, slowly, she dipped 2 fingers into the paste and held them where he could see. "This will draw out the poison," she said, "and help the skin heal." She waited. The pup's breathing stayed shallow, but after a moment, he shifted just slightly, exposing more of his shoulder. Permission. Ara's throat tightened. She moved carefully, parting the matted fur near the first burn. The wound was raw, the edges silver white and angry. She dabbed the salve onto it with the lightest touch she could manage. The pup flinched but didn't pull away. "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry." She worked in silence, finding each burn hidden beneath the tangles of his coat. There were more than she'd first seen. Too many. Her hands shook with the effort of staying steady, of not letting her anger bleed into her touch. Whoever had done this had been methodical, cruel. They'd hidden the wounds where no one would look unless they cared enough to check. When the last burn was covered, Ara sat back and wiped her hands on a clean cloth. The pup's breathing had slowed. His eyes were half closed now, the tension in his small body easing degree by degree. "There," she said softly. That's the worst of it. She poured a little water into a shallow dish and set it near his muzzle. He sniffed once, then lapped weakly at the surface. She waited until he'd drunk his fill before she spoke again. I need to know your name, she said. I can't keep calling you, little one, in my head. The pup stilled. His amber eyes lifted to hers, and for a long moment he simply stared. Then, with effort that seemed to cost him dearly, he pulled himself up onto his haunches. He swayed, unsteady, but he held the position, and in the candlelight she saw it clearly for the first time. The shape of his face, the set of his ears, the particular gold threading through the amber of his eyes. Her breath caught. You're not just any pup, she whispered. You're his son. The Alpha King's son. The pup, Terran, she realized with a jolt. Dipped his head once, a confirmation, a plea for her to understand. Era's heart twisted. She'd heard the stories, the way all the servants had. The king's maid had died, bringing this child into the world. The birth had been hard, and the grief afterward harder. Veyron had shut himself away for months, and when he finally emerged, the light had gone out of him. But she hadn't known the child was suffering too. She hadn't known he'd been left in this room, forgotten or ignored, while someone slowly poisoned him in plain sight. Terran, she said, testing the name. It felt right on her tongue, solid and real. He lowered himself back down, his legs trembling with the effort he'd spent. Ara reached out and rested her hand lightly on his head. You're safe now, she said. I won't let anyone hurt you again. His eyes drifted closed. She wasn't sure if he believed her, but he didn't pull away. She stayed with him through the rest of the night, reapplying salve when the first layer soaked into his skin, offering water and small pieces of soft bread soaked in broth. He ate a little, more than he had in days, she guessed, and by the time the sky outside began to pale, his breathing had deepened into something close to real sleep. Ara tucked a clean blanket around him, careful not to press against the burns, and rose to her feet. Her knees ached from kneeling on the stone, but the discomfort barely registered. She crossed to the table and stared down at the row of bottles. The lavender oil sat where she'd left it the day before, its metallic sheen catching the candlelight. She picked up the other jars one by one, unstoppering each and holding it to the flame. 2 more shimmered with the same faint silver. Her stomach turned. Whoever had done this hadn't stopped at one bottle. They'd laced every grooming oil in the room, ensuring that no matter which one was used, the poison would reach him. Ara's hands curled into fists. She gathered the tainted bottles and wrapped them carefully in a length of cloth, then tucked the bundle into her satchel. She would keep them hidden until she knew who to trust. She glanced back at Terran. He slept now, his small sides rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The sight eased something tight in her chest. I'll be back tonight, she whispered, and every night after, until you're strong again. She blew out the candle and slipped into the corridor. The house was beginning to stir, the first sounds of the kitchen drifting up through the floors below. She moved quickly, her steps light, and made it back to the servants, quarters before anyone saw her. In the narrow room she shared with 2 other maids, Era tucked the satchel beneath her cot and sat on the edge of the thin mattress. Her hands still smelled faintly of comfrey and honey. She thought of Terran's eyes, the way he'd looked at her when he gave his trust, the way he'd pulled himself upright just to let her see who he was. He hadn't shifted in months, she realized. The silver had weakened him too much, leached the strength from his wolf until he couldn't hold any form but this one. A child trapped in a body too sick to change, too tired to fight. Her jaw tightened. She didn't know yet who had paid for the poison. She didn't know if they were still in the house, still watching, still waiting for Terran to fade completely. But she knew she wouldn't let that happen. Ara lay back on the cot and closed her eyes. Her body ached, but her mind wouldn't rest. She thought of the burns hidden in matted fur, the shimmer of silver and glass bottles, the weight of a small muzzle resting in her palm. She thought of the promise she'd made, and the one she was making now, silently to herself. She would heal him. She would find out who had done this. And she would make sure that when the Alpha King finally came home, he would know the truth. Taran deserved that much. He deserved to be seen, to be protected, to be loved the way a child should be, and Ara would not stop until he was. The rider came at midday, dust rising from the road in a thin cloud that hung in the still air. Ara was in the laundry yard, her hands red from lye soap, when she heard the shout from the gate. "The king returns!" The words rippled through the servants like a stone dropped in water. Women straightened, smoothing aprons and tucking back loose hair. Men abandoned their tasks and moved toward the main courtyard, their faces carefully blank. Ara's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She dried her hands on her skirt and followed the others, staying near the back of the gathering crowd. The gates swung open. Hooves clattered on cobblestone. And then he was there. Alpha King Veyron sat astride a gray destrier, his shoulders broad beneath a travel-worn cloak. Dark hair fell just past his collar, threaded with silver at the temples. His face was all hard lines, sharp jaw, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her, pale green, cold as winter frost, and exhausted in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. He dismounted in one smooth motion and handed the reins to a stable hand without a word. The crowd parted as he walked toward the house, his boots striking the stones with quiet authority. Ara watched him disappear through the main doors, then turned and slipped away before anyone noticed. She had to get to Taran first. The western corridor was empty when she reached it. She pushed open the door to his room and found him curled near the window, just as she'd left him that morning. But his head lifted when she entered, and his tail gave a single weak thump against the floor. Progress, small but real. "Your father's home," she said quietly, crossing to kneel beside him. Taran's ears flattened. Something flickered in his amber eyes. Fear, maybe, or shame. Ara's chest tightened. She reached out and ran her hand gently along his back, careful to avoid the healing burns. "He needs to see you," she said. "He needs to know what's been happening." The pup whined low in his throat and pressed closer to the wall. "I know," she whispered, "but you're getting stronger. He'll see that too." She stayed with him, her hand a steady weight, until footsteps sounded in the hall outside. Heavy, purposeful. The door opened without a knock. Veyron filled the doorway, still wearing his cloak, dust clinging to his boots. His gaze swept the room and landed on Taran. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then, something cracked behind his eyes, too fast to name. "Taran?" His voice was low, rough with travel, and something deeper. The pup's ears pricked forward. He lifted his head, and for the first time since Ara had known him, his tail wagged. Just once, hesitant but unmistakable. Veyron crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee beside his son. His hand, broad and scarred, reached out and rested on Taran's head. The pup leaned into the touch, a soft whimper escaping him. "You're awake," Veyron said, and his voice cracked on the last word. Ara stayed very still, her presence forgotten. She watched the king's face as he stroked his son's fur, watched the way his jaw worked, and his eyes reddened at the corners. "I was told you wouldn't eat," Veyron continued, his tone steadying. "That you barely moved." Taran's gaze slid toward Ara. Veyron followed the look. He seemed to notice her for the first time, and his expression shifted, the softness disappearing beneath something colder and more guarded. "Who are you?" Ara rose to her feet, her hands folding in front of her. "Ara, your majesty, I'm one of the housemaids. I was sent to clean this room 3 days ago." His eyes narrowed. "And?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I found Taryn alone. He was unwell. I've been treating him." Treating him. Veyron stood, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, and the weight of his gaze pressed down on her like a physical thing. "With what authority?" "None," she said simply. "Just the knowledge my grandmother gave me." His jaw tightened. "Explain." Ara drew a slow breath. This was the moment. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the cloth-wrapped bundle. She unfolded it carefully, revealing the 3 bottles of tainted oil. "Someone's been poisoning him," she said. "With silver." The silence that followed was absolute. Veyron stared down at the bottles, his face carved from stone. Then, very slowly, he picked one up and held it to the light. The shimmer was faint but unmistakable. "How long?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," Ara said, "but the burns suggest months." His hand closed around the bottle, knuckles white. "Burns?" She nodded toward Taryn. "On his back and sides, hidden under his coat. I've been using comfrey salve to draw out the poison." Veyron turned and knelt again beside his son. This time his hands moved with careful precision, parting the fur along Taryn's shoulder blade. When he found the first burn, half-healed and pale against the skin, his entire body went rigid. "Who did this?" The words came out flat, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. "I don't know yet," Ara said, "but the oils were left here. Someone had access to this room." Veyron rose and turned to face her. His eyes were no longer cold. They burned. "You saved him." It wasn't a question. Ara's throat tightened. "I only did what needed doing." He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then he looked back at his son. "Stay with him," he said. "I'll return shortly." He strode to the door, the bottle still clutched in one hand, but he paused on the threshold and glanced back. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing him." Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Ara exhaled and sank down beside Taryn. Her hands were trembling. The pup nuzzled against her leg, and she rested her palm on his head, grounding herself in the warmth of him. "He knows now," she whispered, "and he won't let it stand." Taryn's eyes drifted closed, but his breathing stayed even, stronger. Ara leaned back against the wall and closed her own eyes. She thought of the king's face when he'd seen the burns, the way his voice had broken on his son's name, the cold, lethal calm that had settled over him when he'd understood what had been done. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she'd done the right thing, and she knew that Taryn, for the first time in months, wasn't alone. Hours passed. The light outside shifted, turning gold and then amber. Ara dozed lightly, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay. She woke to the sound of the door opening again. Veyron entered, his cloak gone, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. There was blood on his knuckles. Ara sat up, her pulse jumping. Taryn stirred beside her, ears swiveling toward his father. Veyron crossed to them and lowered himself to the floor, his movements slower now, heavier. He looked at Ara, and his expression was raw in a way that made her chest ache. "The previous groomer confessed," he said. "He was paid by a rival pack. They wanted Taryn weak, wanted him to fade before he could grow into his strength." Ara's hands clenched in her lap. "Where is he now?" "Gone," Veyron said simply. "He won't hurt anyone again." She nodded, She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Veyron reached out and rested his hand on Terran's side. The pup's tail wagged, stronger this time, and he stretched forward to lick his father's wrist. Something shifted in Veyron's face. The hard lines softened. His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they were wet. "I failed him," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was so lost in my own grief, I didn't see what was happening under my own roof." Ara didn't look away. "You're here now," she said gently. "That's what matters." He met her gaze, and for a moment, she saw past the king to the man beneath, exhausted, grieving, trying. "You gave him back to me," Veyron said. "I don't know how to repay that." "You don't need to," Ara said. "Just love him. That's enough." Veyron's mouth twitched, the ghost of something that might have been a smile. He looked down at his son, and his hand stayed steady and warm on Terran's fur. And in the quiet of that room, with the three of them together, something fragile and new took root. Veyron stayed on the floor beside Terran long after the sun had set. Ara watched the candlelight play across his features, the sharp angles of his face softened by exhaustion, and something gentler she couldn't quite name. His hand never left his son's fur, a steady anchor for them both. "I should go," Ara said quietly, though she made no move to rise. "Stay." The word came quickly, almost rough. Veyron's gaze lifted to hers. "Please. He rests easier when you're here." She settled back against the wall, her legs folded beneath her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It held the weight of shared understanding, of two people who had both kept vigil through dark hours. "How long were you at the border?" she asked softly. 3 weeks, his thumb traced slow circles through Terran's fur. "We've had incursions. Nothing large but persistent. I thought leaving him here was safer than bringing him into that." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong. You couldn't have known." "I should have." The words were flat, final. A father should know when his child is suffering. Ara studied the king in the dim light. Without the armor of ceremony and distance, he looked younger than she'd first thought. Perhaps 30 winters, no more. Grief had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, but beneath that, she could still see the man he might have been, strong-featured, with a straight nose and dark brows. His hair fell in waves, catching bronze in the firelight. There was a scar along his left temple, thin and pale, old. "Grief clouds everything," she said. "It's not weakness. It's love with nowhere left to go." His eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, something had shifted. The cold distance had cracked, and she glimpsed the raw edges beneath. "She died in this room," he said. "My mate, Ilara. The birth went wrong. There was too much blood, and nothing anyone did could stop it." His voice stayed level, but she heard the fracture lines running through each word. "She held him once. Just once. Then she was gone." Ara's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she held herself still. Some wounds needed air before they could bear touch. "I couldn't come in here after," Veyron continued. "Couldn't look at the walls she'd looked at last. So I had him moved to the nursery. Hired people to care for him. Told myself it was enough." He drew a slow breath. "And then I buried myself in the pack's needs because I didn't know how to be a father without her." "But you came back," Ara said gently. "You're here now because a stranger saw what I couldn't." His gaze found hers, and the weight in it made her chest ache. "You walked into this room and saw my son. Not a duty. Not a burden. Just a child who needed someone to care. Era's hands twisted in her lap. I only did what anyone would have. No. The word was quiet but absolute. The household staff have walked past this door for months. None of them stopped. None of them looked closely enough to see the burns or question why he'd grown so still. Veyron's hand stilled on Taryn's back. You did. That means something. The room fell quiet again. Taryn's breathing deepened into true sleep, his small body finally releasing the last threads of tension. Era watched the rise and fall of his ribs, steady and strong, and felt something warm bloom beneath her breastbone. I'll assign new staff to his care, Veyron said after a while. People I trust. And I'll have the healers examine him properly, make sure there's no lasting damage from the silver. That's good, Ara said. Then carefully, but he'll need more than that. Veyron's brow furrowed. What do you mean? He'll need to know he's not alone. She met his gaze directly. That you won't disappear again. That he matters more than borders or pack business or grief. The king's expression tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped. But then his shoulders lowered, and he nodded slowly. You're right. He looked down at Taryn and something in his face gentled. I've been running from this room since the day she died. Running from the memories. From the guilt. His thumb brushed over one of the healing burns, featherlight. But he's here. He's real. And he needs me to stop running. Yes, Ara said simply, he does. Veyron straightened, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off an old weight. When he looked at her again, his eyes were clearer, focused. You said your grandmother taught you to heal. She did. Midwifery, herb lore, wound care. I grew up learning which plants drew poison and which ones eased pain. And you have no formal position here, just housework. Ara nodded. The housekeeper hired me on a week's trial. I needed the work. Veyron was quiet for a moment, his gaze turning inward. Then he rose to his feet in one smooth motion and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then placed her palm in his. His grip was warm, calloused, and steady. He pulled her upright with effortless strength, and for a heartbeat, they stood close enough that she could see the faint gold threading through the green of his eyes. Come with me, he said. She followed him into the corridor, glancing back once at Taryn. The pup slept on, peaceful and safe. Veyron led her through the dim halls to a small study she hadn't seen before. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a fire burned low in the grate. He gestured to a chair, then moved to stand before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. I want you to stay, he said without preamble. Not as a maid. As Taryn's personal caretaker and healer, you'll have rooms near his, authority to make decisions about his care, a salary befitting the role. Ara's breath caught. Your Majesty. Veyron. His mouth curved just slightly. If you're going to be part of my son's life, we can dispense with formality when we're alone. Heat crept up her neck. That's generous, but I'm no one. Just a village girl with a dead grandmother's recipes. You're the person who saved my son's life. Veyron turned to face her fully, and the firelight cast his shadow long across the floor. You're the person who saw him when no one else did. That's not nothing, Ara. The way he said her name, low and careful, sent a shiver down her spine. She folded her arms, trying to steady herself. What about the pack? She asked. Won't they question a stranger being given access to the air? Let them question. His voice hardened. I am Alpha. My word is law, and I say you belong here. The certainty in his tone left no room for argument. Ara studied him, this man who had walked into his son's room with blood on his hands and grief in his eyes, and saw the fierce protectiveness beneath the exhaustion. All right, she said quietly. I'll stay. Something eased in Veyron's posture. He nodded once, then moved to a cabinet and poured 2 glasses of dark amber liquid. He handed one to her. To second chances, he said. She lifted her glass, and their eyes held. To seeing what matters. They drank. The liquor burned warm down her throat, grounding her in the moment. In the firelight and the quiet, and the man standing close enough that she could hear his breathing slow. Thank you, Veyron said again, softer this time, for giving him back to me. Ara set down her glass. Thank you for trusting me with him. He smiled then, small and hesitant, but real. And in that smile, she saw the edges of the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. They returned to Taryn's room together. The pup still slept, curled in a nest of blankets Ara had arranged. Veyron knelt and pressed a kiss to the top of his son's head, then rose and met her gaze. I'll have your things moved tomorrow, he said. For tonight, rest. You've earned it. Ara nodded, though she wasn't sure she'd be able to sleep. Too much had shifted, too quickly. But as she left the room and made her way through the quiet halls, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, fragile and new, but growing stronger with every step. Ara woke to the sound of rain tapping against stone. The small room Veyron had given her sat just down the hall from Taryn's, close enough that she could hear if the pup stirred in the night. She dressed quickly in the simple tunic and trousers that had replaced her maid's uniform, then padded barefoot to his door. She found both of them awake. Taryn lay sprawled on his side near the hearth, and Veyron sat on the floor beside him, one hand resting on the pup's flank. The king's hair was sleep-mussed, his shirt unlaced at the throat. He looked up when she entered, and something warm flickered in his eyes. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly. He had a nightmare, Veyron said. I heard him whimpering through the wall. Ara crossed to them and knelt. Taryn's tail thumped once in greeting, stronger than it had been days ago. The burns were nearly healed now, pale pink instead of angry red. His coat had begun to regain its luster, where she'd been brushing out the mats each evening. How is he? She asked. Better. Veyron's thumb traced gentle circles through the fur. He ate all his breakfast this morning, even tried to chase a leaf the wind blew in. A smile tugged at Ara's mouth. That's good. That's really good. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle and shift. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the window in a steady rhythm. Taryn's eyes drifted closed again, lulled by the warmth and the presence of the 2 people who loved him most. I've been thinking, Veyron said after a while. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. About what you said, that he needs to know he's not alone. Ara glanced at him. Yes? I've started taking meals with him, reading to him in the evenings. But I realize I don't know how to talk to him, not the way I should. He paused, his jaw working. Alara was the one who knew how to do that. How to make someone feel seen. I was always better at strategy and borders than tenderness. You're learning, Ara said gently. That's what matters. Veyron's gaze stayed on his son. I look at him sometimes and I see her. The shape of his eyes, the way he tilts his head when he's curious. And it hurts, but it also reminds me that she's not completely gone. That part of her is still here, in him. Ara's chest tightened. She reached out slowly and rested her hand over his, where it lay on Taryn's back. His skin was warm beneath her palm, rough with old scars. She'd be proud of you, she said, for coming back to him, for trying. Veyron turned his hand beneath hers, his fingers curling around hers. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent warmth spreading through her. He met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. I don't think I've said this properly, he said, but I'm grateful you're here. Not just for Taryn. For me, too. Her breath caught. Veyron. I mean it. His grip tightened just slightly. This house has been empty for so long, full of people, but empty. And then you walked in, and everything shifted. You reminded me what it means to care, to see past the weight of duty and just feel. Ara didn't know what to say. The words lodged in her throat, too big and fragile to speak aloud. So instead, she squeezed his hand, letting the pressure say what her voice couldn't. They stayed like that, hands joined over the sleeping pup, while the rain fell and the fire burned low. And in the quiet, Ara felt the walls she'd built around her own heart begin to crack. She'd lost her family young, her mother to fever, her grandmother to age. She'd learned to move through the world alone, to keep her head down and her heart guarded. But here, in this room, with this man and this child, she felt something she'd thought she'd never feel again. Belonging. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Ara spent her mornings with Taryn, continuing his treatments and coaxing him to eat and play. Veyron joined them each evening, and the three of them would sit together by the fire while he read aloud from old stories or simply talked about his day. Taryn grew stronger. His appetite returned fully, and he began to move with the clumsy energy of a healthy pup. He play-growled at shadows and pounced on Ara's skirts, and every time he did, Veyron's face would light with something close to joy. But the nights were different. The nights were when the grief crept back in, when the weight of memory pressed too hard. Ara would wake to the sound of footsteps in the hall and find Veyron standing outside Taryn's door, staring at nothing. The first time it happened, she didn't speak. She simply stood beside him, a silent presence in the dark. After a moment, he'd turned and walked away. The second time, she touched his arm. "Do you want to talk about it?" He'd shaken his head, but he hadn't pulled away. The third time, he spoke. "I keep thinking about the moment she died," he said, his voice raw. "The way the light went out of her eyes. The way I couldn't do anything but watch." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I'm the alpha. I'm supposed to protect my pack. My family. And I couldn't save her." Ara's throat ached. "It wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was so naked it stole her breath. "I'm the one who got her pregnant. I'm the one who didn't call the healer sooner when the labor went wrong. I'm the one who—" "Stop." The word came out sharper than she intended. She stepped closer, her hand finding his chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heart beneath her palm. "You can't carry that. It'll break you. Maybe I deserve to be broken." "No." She looked up at him, her voice steady. "You deserve to heal. Just like Taryn, just like anyone who suffered." His eyes searched hers, desperate and lost. And then, slowly, his hand came up to cover hers. His fingers trembled. "I don't know how," he whispered. "One day at a time," she said. "One moment. You don't have to do it alone." Something cracked in his expression. He exhaled shakily and leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. They stood like that, breathing together in the dim corridor, and Ara felt the tension in him ease degree by degree. "Thank you," he murmured, "for staying. For not running when you saw how broken I am." "You're not broken," she said softly. "You're healing. There's a difference." When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet but clearer. He lifted her hand from his chest and pressed it gently between both of his. "You make me believe that," he said, "that things can be different, better." Ara's heart stumbled. She wanted to tell him that he made her believe the same, that for the first time in years, she felt like she had a place in the world, a purpose that went deeper than survival. But the words felt too large, too soon. So she simply nodded and let him hold her hand a moment longer before he released it and stepped back. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rougher now. "Tomorrow, Taryn's going to run you ragged. He's been eyeing the courtyard all day," she smiled. "I'll manage." He returned the smile, small but genuine, and then turned and walked back toward his own chambers. Ara watched him go, her hand still warm from his touch, and felt the fragile thread between them pull just a little tighter. The moon rose full and heavy over the eastern ridge, its light spilling silver across the courtyard stones. Ara stood at the window of Taryn's room, watching the way it painted everything pale and strange. Behind her, she heard the soft pad of footsteps and turned to find Veyron in the doorway. "It's time," he said quietly. She nodded, her pulse quickening. They'd been waiting for this night, preparing Taryn gently over the past week. The pup was strong enough now, the silver fully purged from his system, the burns healed to faint scars beneath healthy fur. But shifting required more than physical strength. It required trust and safety, and the deep certainty that he could let go. Taryn lay by the hearth, his amber eyes tracking them both. His tail wagged once, tentative but present. Veyron crossed the room and knelt beside his son. "Tonight, if you're ready, we'll go outside. The moon is full. Your wolf will feel the pull." He rested his hand on Taryn's head, his voice steady and sure. "I'll be with you. Ara will be with you. You're safe." The pup rose to his feet, steadier than he'd been in months. He shook himself, and his coat rippled like water in lamplight. Ara gathered a blanket and followed them into the corridor. The house was quiet, most of the pack already asleep or gathered in the great hall for the moon rites. They moved through empty passages until they reached a side door that opened onto a walled garden. The moonlight was stronger here, unfiltered by glass or stone. It washed over them in waves, cool and electric. Ara felt the pull of it in her own blood, faint but real. She wasn't a shifter, but her grandmother had told her once that the moon called to anyone who'd learned to listen. Veyron led them to the center of the garden where the grass grew thick and soft. He turned to face Taryn, then dropped smoothly to one knee. "I'm going to shift first," he said. "So you can see, so you remember how it feels?" Ara stepped back, giving him space. She watched as Veyron closed his eyes and drew a long breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then light rippled beneath his skin, silver gold and ancient. His form blurred and reformed, bones shifting with a sound like wind through trees. When the light faded, a massive wolf stood where the king had been. His coat was dark gray, threaded with black, and his eyes were the same pale green, sharp and knowing. He was easily twice the size of any natural wolf, power and grace coiled in every line of his body. Taryn stared, his small form frozen. Then his tail began to wag, faster and faster, and he gave a high, excited yip. The great wolf lowered his head and touched his nose to Taryn's. A gentle nudge. An invitation. Ara's throat tightened. She folded her arms across her chest and waited, hardly daring to breathe. Taryn turned in a circle, his movements growing more agitated. He whined once, a sound caught between fear and longing. Then he sat and looked up at the moon. The light seemed to find him, pouring down like water. His small body trembled. Ara saw the moment he stopped fighting, the instant he let the pull take him. Silver fire bloomed along his spine, spreading outward in waves that made the air shimmer. And then he was changing. It happened faster than Veyron's shift, wild and instinctive. Terran's form stretched and blurred, his limbs lengthening, his muzzle sharpening. The light flared once, bright enough to make Ara shield her eyes, and then faded. A young wolf stood in the grass, gangly and unsteady, but whole. His coat was lighter than his father's, a soft amber gray that caught the moonlight. His eyes were the same warm gold they'd always been, but now they held something new. Freedom. Terran took one wobbling step, then another. His legs splayed like a newborn fawn's, and he tumbled sideways into the grass. He scrambled upright and shook himself, ears flopping, and tried again. Veyron shifted back in a smooth ripple of light. He stood naked for a heartbeat, then pulled on the trousers he'd left folded nearby. His face was wet, and he made no effort to hide it. "Terran?" he said, and his voice broke on the name. The young wolf turned and bounded toward him, still clumsy but gaining confidence with every stride. He crashed into Veyron's legs and nearly knocked him over. Veyron laughed, a sound Ara had never heard from him, raw and joyful and utterly unguarded. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around his son, burying his face in the soft fur. Terran wriggled and licked at his father's face, tail wagging so hard his entire back end swayed. Ara pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She watched them hold each other in the moonlight, father and son reunited in a way that went deeper than words or form. This was what healing looked like. This was what love looked like when it finally found its way home. After a long moment, Veyron lifted his head and looked at her. His eyes were bright, his face open in a way she'd never seen. "Come here," he said softly. She crossed the grass on unsteady legs. Terran turned and bounded toward her, nearly bowling her over in his enthusiasm. She laughed and sank to her knees, letting him lick her face and paw at her shoulders. "You did it," she whispered, running her hands through his thick fur. "You're so strong, so brave." Terran yipped and spun in a circle, then took off across the garden in a loping run. He was awkward still, tripping over his own paws, but the joy in every movement was unmistakable. Veyron stood and moved to Ara's side. They watched Terran race back and forth, chasing shadows and snapping at the wind. "I didn't think I'd ever see this," Veyron said quietly. "I thought I'd lost him, that he'd fade before he ever had the chance to become what he was meant to be." Ara looked up at him. "But he didn't. He fought. And you came back to him." "We came back to him." Veyron's hand found hers, his fingers warm and sure. "You gave him the strength to hold on. Gave me the courage to stop running." He turned to face her fully, and the moonlight carved his features in silver. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't walked into that room." "You would have found another way," she said. "You love him. That would have been enough eventually." "Maybe." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "But I'm grateful I didn't have to do it alone." Terran trotted back to them, panting happily. He flopped down at their feet and rolled onto his back, legs in the air, tongue lolling. Ara laughed and knelt to rub his belly. "Show off!" Veyron crouched beside them, his hand still holding hers. The three of them sat together in the moonlit garden, and something settled in Ara's chest. Something that felt like home. "Stay with us," Veyron said suddenly, "not just as his caretaker, as part of our family." Ara's breath caught. She looked at Terran, who gazed up at her with complete trust, then at Veyron, whose eyes held the same vulnerable hope. "I'm already staying," she said softly. "I know. But I mean—" He paused, searching for words. "I mean stay as someone who belongs here, someone who matters. To him, to me." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Veyron." "I'm not asking for promises," he said quickly. I know it's too soon. I know we're still finding our way. But I need you to know that you're not just the woman who saved my son. You're the woman who reminded me what it feels like to want more than survival. Ara's vision blurred. She turned her hand in his and laced their fingers together. I want that too, she whispered. I want to stay. I want to be part of this. Something bright and fierce flared in his eyes. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. Taryn yipped and wiggled between them, demanding attention. They both laughed and pulled him close, the three of them tangled together in the grass beneath the watching moon. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future felt like something worth reaching for. The morning after the shift, Ara woke to sunlight streaming through the narrow window of her room. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache. The pleasant exhaustion of a night spent laughing and running through moonlit grass with a young wolf who couldn't stop celebrating his newfound freedom. She dressed slowly, braiding her hair with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had changed in the span of a single moon. When she entered Taryn's room, she found it empty. Her heart lurched before she heard voices drifting from the corridor. She followed the sound to the small dining room Veyron had claimed as their private space, away from the formal halls where the pack gathered. Taryn sat at the table in his human form, a boy of perhaps 6 winters, with amber eyes and tousled brown hair. He wore a simple tunic that hung loose on his thin frame, and he was shoveling porridge into his mouth with single-minded focus. Veyron sat beside him, one hand resting on the back of the boy's chair. He looked up when Ara entered, and the smile that crossed his face made warmth bloom beneath her breastbone. "Good morning," he said softly. Ara's throat tightened. She'd known Taryn would be able to shift back. She'd prepared herself for it. But seeing him like this, fully human and whole, drove home just how close they'd come to losing him. "Good morning," she managed. She moved to the table and sat across from them. "How are you feeling, Taryn?" The boy looked up, his cheeks bulging with food. He swallowed hard and grinned. "Strong," he said, his voice higher and sweeter than she'd expected. "Papa says I can go outside today. Really outside, not just the garden." "If you promise to stay close," Veyron added, his tone firm but gentle. "And if Ara agrees to come with us." Taryn's eyes swung to her, wide and hopeful. "Will you? Please?" She couldn't have said no if she'd wanted to. Of course. The boy bounced in his seat, nearly upsetting his bowl. Veyron steadied it with one hand, shaking his head but unable to hide his smile. They spent the afternoon in the hills beyond the estate, the three of them walking the narrow trails that wound through stands of pine and birch. Taryn ran ahead, shifting between forms with the ease of a child testing new muscles. One moment he was a boy scrambling over rocks, the next a young wolf darting after rabbits. Ara watched him with her heart in her throat, marveling at the transformation. Veyron walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed with every step. "He's never been like this," Veyron said quietly. "So free, so happy." "He's healing," Ara said. "All of him, not just his body." Veyron's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with the easy familiarity of something they'd done 100 times before. "Because of you." She wanted to argue, to deflect the praise, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was something raw there, something that went beyond gratitude. "I meant what I said last night," he continued, "about you being part of this family. Part of us." Ara's pulse quickened. "I know, but I need to say the rest of it." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Ahead of them, Taryn was chasing a butterfly through a patch of wildflowers, his laughter ringing bright in the clear air. I need you to know that it's not just about Taryn. It's about what I feel when you're near. Her breath caught. Veyron, I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, he said, his voice low and steady. After Alara died, I thought that part of me died too. That I'd spend the rest of my life going through the motions, doing my duty, but never really living. He lifted their joined hands and pressed her palm to his chest. She felt the steady thud of his heart beneath her fingers. And then you walked into that room and everything changed. You didn't just save my son. You reminded me what it means to feel, to hope, to want something more than just survival. Era's vision blurred. She blinked hard, trying to hold the tears back, but they came anyway. I was just a maid who knew how to use herbs. You were never just anything. His free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the wetness on her cheek. You saw us when we were at our lowest. You stayed when you had every reason to walk away, and you gave us back to each other. His eyes searched hers, and she saw the vulnerability there, the fear that she might not feel the same. I love you, he said, the words simple and raw. I know it's fast. I know we're still finding our way. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. It's not gratitude or relief or anything else that might fade. It's love. The world seemed to still around them. The breeze died. The bird's song faded. All that existed was the man in front of her, and the weight of his confession settling over her like a blessing. I love you too, she whispered, and saying it felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. I think I have since the night you came home and knelt beside Taryn. When I saw how much you loved him, even through your pain. Something bright and fierce flared in Veyron's eyes. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't want to. She rose on her toes and met him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like they were both afraid of breaking something fragile. But then his hand slid into her hair, and her fingers curled into his shirt, and the kiss deepened, became something warmer and more certain. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Veyron rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Stay with us, he said again, not as a caretaker, not as a healer, as my mate, as Taryn's mother if you'll have us. Ara's heart felt too large for her chest. She pulled back just enough to see his face, to make sure he understood what he was offering. Are you sure? The pack can question all they like, he said firmly. You belong here, with us, and I'll make sure everyone knows it. Before she could answer, Taryn came bounding back, still in wolf form. He skidded to a halt between them and shifted, appearing as a grinning boy with grass in his hair. Are you kissing? He asked, his tone caught between curiosity and delight. Veyron laughed, the sound full and unguarded. Yes. Is that all right with you? Taryn looked from his father to Ara, his amber eyes bright. Does that mean she's staying forever? If she'll have us, Veyron said, his gaze returning to Ara. Taryn launched himself at her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Please stay. Please. I don't want you to go away. Ara knelt and pulled him close, breathing in the scent of sun and grass and healthy child. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. I'm staying. With both of you. Taryn squeezed her tighter, and when she looked up, Veyron was watching them with such tenderness it made her chest ache. He held out his hand, and she took it, rising with Taryn still clinging to her side. The three of them stood together on the hillside, the future spreading out before them like the land below. Veyron pulled them both close, his arms wrapping around them, and Ara felt the last of her walls crumble. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd never dared to hope for. "Thank you," Veyron murmured against her hair. "For choosing us." "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered back. Taryn wriggled free and shifted again, bounding away with a joyful howl. Veyron and Ara followed hand in hand, their laughter rising to meet the sky. And in the warmth of the afternoon sun, with the man she loved beside her, and the child they both cherished running ahead, Ara finally understood what it meant to be whole.